So this whole semester is a series on healing in the Heretics series, which I think is very timely. And I was actually part of the team together with Mark and Corey and Barry and other people sort of choosing that theme for the whole semester. And we did that a couple months ago when we were in the middle of so many unhealthy situations. COVID and the Trump presidency and the racial violence stuff, the killing of George Floyd. I mean, it's just so much healing that needed to be done and still needs to be done. And actually Lara's talk on racial healing was very much, I think, part of thinking about that. So I think it's an important topic on an individual and collective social level. It's an important topic at a local level here at Colgate, but also national and global one. It's an important topic in physical terms and mental terms, and in medical and political terms, because injustice is an injury too. So there is an overlap between unhealthy, damaging things that are going on in the physical realm and in the political realm. And healing will also have to address those things from those different perspectives, I think. And so my talk within this larger series on healing, this whole semester, my talk is on liberal education and healing. And I always like to do something that is self-referential, whatever topic we talk about in Heretics, to take it to Colgate and say the stuff that we are doing, liberal education, learning, how does that apply to it? And how does it apply to what we do at Colgate, what I do personally as somebody who teaches here and as somebody who used to be a student, and even how does it apply to this particular event? Can we make this a little bit of a healing practice? And this thing with the names was one first aspect of that, because I think it's a healing practice that helps to heal the anonymity and the social isolation that people experience, particularly in COVID times, that we're just getting a few more faces and the voices that go with them, and the names is already something, I think, of a healing learning experience. And we'll have a couple of mini practices in this session that I hope practice some mini form of healing, so that we're not just talking about it, but making it happen in this now 45 minutes that we have left together. So my talk is how can liberal education help us heal ourselves and the world? And I want to also be aware of, as I answer that question, it's not just about healing, it's always also about the opposite, that would be harming. And actually in last week's Heretics, 2 weeks ago, Rebecca Scheiner, Mark Scheiner's wife and a psychology professor here, was in the discussion talking about psychotherapy and what she referred to as iatrogenic effects, which means negative damage caused by a doctor. So therapy is meant to help people, but it's a well-known fact that it can also go wrong and then not only not heal, but actually do harm. And so the equivalent for that would be, I guess, in college would be didascalogenic effects, teacher-induced harm. And as somebody who is teaching at Colgate, I'm acutely aware that that can happen to me. And so part of this is also an attempt to maybe think about how can I avoid me, and I'll avoid that, and I'll count on your help in doing that. So my first, since I'm a professor here and I teach legacies of the ancient world, ancient texts, I always like to go to some of the ancient texts first and then see how does that play out in our lives here today. So I just want to throw a few things at you from those ancient traditions, starting with a quote from the Greek philosopher Epicurus. And he has a lovely saying, it's a fragmentary saying that goes like this, and I'll first recite it to you in Greek. Kenos ekeno philosopho logos hume den patos anthropo therapeutai. And that means in English, void, empty, pointless is the doctrine of a scholar that doesn't heal a human ailment or illness. Any doctrine of a scholar that does not heal, whether it's true or not true, doesn't matter. Any doctrine, any theory of a scholar that doesn't heal is thereby irrelevant, pointless, void, empty. And I call that the therapeutic imperative for learning, teaching, and research. It's meant to make life better. It's meant to heal. And it's interesting that a contemporary, not of Epicure, but of Socrates, was Hippocrates. So that actually the sort of the founding father of medicine is a contemporary of the founding father of liberal education, if you want, Socrates and Hippocrates. And Socrates actually quotes Hippocrates too. They actually knew each other. So this idea that how to heal and what the right practices are happens at the same time as the rise of Socratic philosophy and the ideal of liberal education. Those things kind of go together. And that makes one wonder, should we take the Hippocratic Oath and transfer that to liberal education and say, first do no harm should be part of our oath as people who teach here at Colgate. And what would that change maybe? So that's maybe an interesting thing to think about. So from Epicure's perspective, that is the point of what learning, teaching, research does, is to heal. He doesn't say what that happens. It seems to say that sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't happen, but he says it needs to happen for it to be good, the learning experience. There are some cultural traditions, learning traditions, that are very optimistic about the potential of learning to heal, and not just by learning like you learn in medical school. You learn how to heal and then you apply that. But there are some schools of thought and practice that think the learning itself is already the healing of oneself and or of the world. And just to give you a couple of examples there, it is definitely a tradition in Buddhism and in yoga philosophy that as you learn, as you practice, as you get to certain insights, those insights in themselves will heal you, will actually lead to salvation. So having, say, like the Buddha, that moment of insight, at the same time, it doesn't just tell you how to get to healing, but does heal you in itself. In biblical traditions, we have similar things. I just want to read a couple of verses here from the first Psalm, Psalm 1, and this is about studying, learning, reading the teaching, the Torah. And it goes like this: happy is the man who has not followed the counsel of the wicked, or taken the path of sinners, or joined the company of the insolent. Rather, the teaching of the Lord is his delight, and he studies that teaching day and night. He is like a tree planted beside streams of waters, which yields its fruit in season, whose foliage never fades, and whatever it produces thrives. So here, learning is identical with thriving. It's not just that you get rewarded. It in itself is a way of flourishing, if not healing. In a more modern tradition, psychoanalysis makes very similar claims. Freud, in his introduction to psychoanalysis, writes that as we learn within the therapeutic process about what's wrong in us, what our hang-ups are, as we learn that, they dissolve. That's the idea of Freud's version of psychotherapy, is figuring out what's going on in you will in itself heal it. And again, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. Rebecca China mentioned that the other day, but there is this optimism that in certain scenarios, learning itself is in itself a healing activity. Then there's, of course, also all the way back to ancient traditions, a great skepticism about all of this. We just read with a couple of students who are in attendance here today, we read the Tao Te Ching, and they say, the Tao Te Ching says, banish knowledge and people will benefit 100-fold. The Lao Tzu is very skeptical about the value of learning, of studying for healing. Again, from a biblical perspective, we have in the book of Ecclesiastes, in the wisdom literature, we have quotes like, this is Ecclesiastes 1:18, in much wisdom is much grief, and he that increases knowledge increases sorrow. Or later in that same book of Ecclesiastes 12:12, of making many books, there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. And since we're right around midterm time right now, I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that much. Study is a weariness of the flesh, and actually of the mind too, not just of the flesh. So there's also pessimism about whether learning is in itself healing, or whether there can be really harmful effects of learning and in learning, depending on one's learning style. So Ecclesiastes would caution us, and I'm sure a lot of us have had that experience, that learning can also be hurtful and harmful. Going to the liberal education, it's my third ancient source here from liberal education as constructed by Plato and Aristotle. And there you have kind of a balance. There is liberal education, which is free learning of free people in their free time for its own sake. And that is seen as healthy and health promoting. And there is illiberal education, which is unfree, under the gun for an external purpose, coercive learning, learning for external rewards, whether it's a grade or whether it's money or whether it's honor or other kinds of external rewards, is seen as inherently unfree and inherently unhealthy, and actually impairing, maiming the body and the mind. This is pretty strongly expressed in Plato's Theaetetus, in the passages 172c to 176a for people who like to look up things in their Plato, 172c to 176a. And he compares the person who grows up in liberal education, has this free growth and expands in all sorts of directions, with a person who is learning in a constrained, coercive environment, under time pressure, under other coercive forces, particularly in law courts, where you have to make a case, you're being judged, you have a limited amount of time, you have no choice what to talk about, you have to make your case. And he says those people will get bent, distorted, crippled really in their mind. And he says this person who goes that second route grows up to manhood with a mind that has no health in it, having now become, in his own eyes, a man of ability and wisdom. So part of the illness there is that the person doesn't even realize how impaired he or she has become through the educational process, how much that has taken away from that person's potential for growth and from that person's freedom. So there we have an alternative and kind of a choice and an imperative to do the liberal education thing and not the other thing, that free learning will be healing, unfree learning will be harming, and that it's our responsibility to do one and not the other. So, and at this point, I would just like to very quickly sneak in a second practice, and that is twofold. One is to just take a minute for you and take notes on a learning experience in your life where you feel this has been either healing or harming, your choice. And you don't have to share it later, but I just want you to think about in your own life about a moment, an experience, a learning experience that you felt was particularly either healing for you and maybe the world around you, or particularly hurtful, harmful, wounding for you and your environment. So I'll just give you 1 minute to think about that, and then I'll keep going. Okay, thank you. And maybe we can draw on that in the discussion part that we'll get to, I hope, soon. I only have a couple more minutes that I'm talking, then I hope we can open this up into the conversation and bring your experiences to the table. So for me, how is this playing out right here, right now at Colgate, and in my own changing relationship to liberal education? So one thing where I basically kind of stand with Plato and Aristotle on the free and unfree learning, and that's a little bit of a problem because I am working in a setting where I have a captive audience. And so it's sort of an inherent contradiction there. How can I increase the wiggle room, which I believe is healing? I do think freedom heals, and I do think captivity harms. So how can I, in a system that is set up to, in certain coercive terms, how can I create those spaces? One thing for me is to really think integratively about body, mind, and environment in all learning and in all teaching, in all research. Not just make it purely cerebral, not just make it purely about getting things right, having the right theory or propositions that can stand, but sort of making it an integrative cultivation of the body, the perceptive qualities, our sensory perception and our motoric action, the mind, and there I mean both cognition and emotion, and the environment, the physical and social environment. How can we cultivate them in sort of not unison, but in dialogue, rather than playing them off against each other? Because one of my convictions is one of the things that is hurtful about learning at Colgate, for example, is that it's too narrowly focused on cerebral and competitive performance, either of the mind or of the body. In athletics, we have the same issue, and that's all about the body. I do think if we maximize performance, there will be collateral damage to body, to mind, and to social and physical environment. And that is the part that I would add to Plato and Aristotle. They don't think much about the environment. They think about body and mind. I think the social environment, the physical environment are equally important as sources for our well-being, as potentially harmful factors, but also as things we can engage and cultivate as part of our learning. So trying to bring those things together in the learning process itself, so that instead of having lots of collateral damage as we write our brilliant papers or do our brilliant athletic performances, that we have positive collateral benefits, not collateral damage, but collateral benefit, and that we cultivate those side effects very consciously. So if this were a heretics lunch like in the good old days, last time I did this with a real lunch, I tried to source that organically, locally, and had people work with their food as part of the meeting. So trying to say, this is not just, okay, we also want to eat. How can we make this part of the learning experience itself? How can we make that an integrative experience? The other thing for myself that has led to, and this goes particularly with Eastern texts from the Buddhist and Taoist tradition, is to try to bring more mindfulness practices like meditation, like the stuff we just did, and I have one more for you, into the learning itself, and saying it's not just about cultivating skills and imparting information. There are other ways of learning that are just as important, and that the other stuff can be embedded in. And I think that actually is true too for healing process for the social and political environment. Last semester, the whole series of Heretics was about race, and there's a beautiful book that I highly recommend. This is Rhonda McGee, The Inner Work of Racial Justice. She's a fabulous person, a woman of color, a law professor in San Francisco, also kind of a mindfulness guru, and she has great things to say about how just studying racism will not make it go away. How can we have a kind of learning about race that is more integrative and helps us overcome it as we study it, where the healing is not just a later result of the learning, but built into learning as racial healing. And I think she's very impressive that way. And lastly, for me, that then means that somehow we have to see learning and teaching and studying also as a work of care and love, and bringing that into the process itself. We can bring that back to Socrates, who in the symposium says the only thing that he understands is the art of love. And that seems maybe odd, and maybe he's just joking. Maybe he's not. I think he's not joking. I think he means it. I don't think if somebody applied for a job as a professor at Colgate and told anybody at the job interview, the one thing I really understand is the art of love, that would get you a job at Colgate. But it's interesting that Socrates said that is his credential for basically philosophy, for learning, for liberal education. And so one question is, how can we build more of that into learning, teaching, research? Finally, as I try to bring body, mind, and environment together in this sort of learning as healing process, one thing from the German tradition, and I am from Germany, is the word Bildung, B-I-L-D-U-N-G. And that means learning, education, but it also means development. So I do think if we think of learning not as something that I do to my brain and stuff more things in here, but as a development, a learning development of my body, my mind, and my environment, ideally, then I think that can be a different way of bringing healing into the learning process itself and keeping health in the learning process itself. So I want to think with you in a minute on how that can play out here. Cool. First, though, one more wellness practice, and that would be, for that, you can turn your screens off for a second, and but keep the audio on so you can hear me. What I would like you to do is get up. If you're sitting down, stand up and find a place where you can look out a window, or where you can look, not just stare at the screen, where you can rest your eyes and look far. Just sort of 20 seconds for finding a place where you can see farther than the whatever 1 foot between you and the screen. Just enjoying that, letting the eyes go way into the distance, and let them rest in that long view, truly taking the long view in that sense. And just sinking into that lovely expanse, no matter how far it is from you, but just looking a little farther and taking a breath as you do that. And then closing the eyes. And then opening them again. And this time trying to take in the whole 180 degrees that you can see, the panorama in front of you, not the far distance, but the width of our field of vision, which is so beautiful. And so much of the time we're fixated on one little point on the screen. We're just staring at that screen. So just enjoying for a moment the enormous range of vision that our eyes have to the left and to the right. And taking that in, resting the eyes in that vastness of space to the left and the right. And then closing the eyes again for just a moment and enjoying the dark. Our screens bombard us with light all the time. And just for a moment, not having that input and just being in the dark. Okay, thank you. And if you can turn your screens back on, let's go into the conversation part.